The cabin of the international flight was alive with the usual pre-flight bustle. The flight attendants were going through their final preparations, moving up and down the aisles as the plane readied for takeoff. The first-class section, bathed in soft golden lighting, was filled with the luxurious sounds of business people making small talk, the soft hum of overhead compartments closing, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. A sharply dressed black man in his early 40s sat comfortably in his first-class seat. He exuded an air of quiet confidence. His tailored suit fit him perfectly. The black leather briefcase at his side gleamed under the cabin's soft lighting, and his polished shoes clicked faintly as he crossed his legs. His demeanor was composed, a man used to success, yet humble in his actions. He gazed out of the window, his calm eyes watching the airport ground crew work swiftly below. The first-class section of the flight was exactly as it should be, peaceful, comfortable, and well-suited to the needs of its passengers. But there was an unsettling tension building just behind the scenes. A flight attendant, an older woman in her 50s, with short, platinum-blonde hair and a stern face, had been watching the man since he entered the cabin. Her movements as she went about her work were mechanical, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something judgmental in her gaze. Her eyes kept darting toward the black man as though she was trying to place him, as if his presence in the first-class section of the plane was out of place. Finally, as the boarding process began to wind down and the plane was preparing for takeoff, she made her move. With a practiced air of authority, she approached the man's seat. Her smile was tight, forced, as she leaned in, offering what was supposed to be a welcoming greeting. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a sharp edge in her voice. "I believe you're in the wrong section. First class is reserved for, well, those who can afford it. Are you sure this is where you belong?" The man's brows furrowed in confusion as he looked up at her. He was taken aback by her insinuation, her condescending tone a stark contrast to the professionalism one would expect on a flight. He had been a frequent flyer with this airline for years, always traveling in first class for his business dealings, so he was well accustomed to the treatment of first-class passengers. This, however, felt different. The woman's eyes weren't just skeptical, they were cold, and there was something in her expression that made it clear she wasn't just doubting his ticket, she was judging his very presence here. Before he could even respond, she continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You must be lost, sir. This isn't the kind of seat people like you usually go for." The words hung in the air for a moment. The other passengers in the first-class section glanced over, some of them uncomfortable with what was unfolding, but none daring to speak up. The tension in the air was thick, and the man could feel the heat of her gaze boring into him, as though she was expecting him to apologize or explain himself. But he remained still, keeping his composure, the cool confidence he had when he walked onto the plane unwavering. In that moment, the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin seemed to shrink, and it was replaced by an uncomfortable reality. Would he remain silent, or would he call out the blatant racism that was so blatantly displayed? It was a choice that could define the course of the entire flight. What happened next would not only shock this flight attendant, but would also leave every person on board reeling. The man's calm and measured response caught the flight attendant off guard. His eyes were steady, and his voice was even as he retrieved his boarding pass from his briefcase. With a deliberate motion, he handed it to her, letting her read it for herself. The printed seat assignment was clearly marked in first class. His demeanor was one of quiet confidence, as though this was a routine interaction, though deep down he knew better. This wasn't a regular encounter. It was laced with unspoken judgment, an unfounded assumption about his place on the plane. "I'm exactly where I belong," he said, his voice unshaken but firm. "Here is my boarding pass." For a moment, the attendant paused, her eyes scanning the boarding pass and then glancing back at him. The silence hung in the air for a brief second, but instead of offering an apology or even a polite acknowledgement of the mistake, she simply scoffed, the contempt clear in her tone. She could have let the situation go, could have recognized the misunderstanding and moved on, but she didn't. Instead, her next words, laced with bitterness, only served to escalate the situation further. "I guess the system made an error," she muttered, her voice still dripping with disdain. "I don't see many people like you in this part of the plane. Must be a mistake, right?" The insinuation in her words was clear. She wasn't just questioning his presence in first class. She was implying that he, a black man, didn't belong there. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the cabin growing palpable. Some passengers stole quick glances toward the interaction, but most remained silent, unsure of what to do or say. The man's face remained stoic, but inside he could feel the frustration building. This wasn't just about a seat assignment. This was about respect, about being treated with dignity despite her prejudices. He knew he could either let it slide, remain silent, and suffer in this uncomfortable exchange, or he could call out the injustice for what it was. He chose the latter, maintaining his composure but making it clear that he would not tolerate such behavior. "Excuse me," he said, his voice now carrying across the cabin, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I've worked hard for everything I have in this life, and I deserve respect just like anyone else. If the airline made an error, that's one thing, but your behavior here is another matter altogether. I don't appreciate being treated this way." The flight attendant's face flushed with irritation. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially in front of a group. For a moment, it looked as though she might say something snide, but she hesitated. Before she could muster another dismissive comment, the ripple effect of his words started to spread through the cabin. Nearby passengers, who had been watching the exchange unfold in uncomfortable silence, began murmuring among themselves. The subtle disapproval was now more evident. Some passengers exchanged knowing looks, others shook their heads at the attendant's behavior, and a few even raised their eyebrows in disbelief. The atmosphere had shifted. What was once a scene of quiet discomfort had now grown into a situation everyone could feel. At that moment, a young woman seated across the aisle stood up. She had been watching the exchange with a mix of shock and anger. She couldn't stand by any longer, witnessing such blatant unprofessionalism, especially when directed at a man who had done nothing wrong. Without hesitation, she addressed the flight attendant, her voice cutting through the air. "Excuse me," the young woman said, her tone sharp. "This is completely unacceptable. You've humiliated this man for no reason. He's shown nothing but patience and composure, and you've treated him like an outsider in his own seat. You should be ashamed of yourself." The flight attendant, taken aback by the public challenge, opened her mouth to respond, but quickly shut it when she realized the growing support from the passengers. The young woman's words had hit a nerve with those around her, and the energy in the cabin had shifted from one of tension to one of support for the man. Others who had been quietly observing now began to speak up, voicing their agreement with the young woman. "Yeah, that's not right," a man from across the aisle added, nodding toward the black passenger. "Everyone here paid for their seat. He deserves to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." "Exactly." Another voice piped up from a few rows behind. "You don't get to treat people like that. It's 2021, for crying out loud." The flight attendant was now surrounded by murmurs of support for the black man, and the unease she once felt in her position had quickly shifted to one of discomfort. She stood there in silence, her face reddening with embarrassment as the voices around her continued to express disapproval. The collective sentiment of the cabin had shifted, and it was no longer just a confrontation between her and the man. It had become a confrontation with the very values of fairness and respect. The flight attendant's behavior had drawn unwanted attention, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, it was clear that no one on board would forget this moment any time soon. What had started as a subtle act of discrimination was now becoming a lesson in accountability, with the passengers joining forces to stand against the injustice. The man sat back in his seat, calm but with a small sense of pride in knowing that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had stood up for himself, and now, so had the people around him. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin slowly simmered down, but the aftershocks of the altercation between the flight attendant and the black man lingered in the air. Passengers shifted in their seats, some still exchanging whispers and glances, while the flight attendant stood by in a state of shock and embarrassment. The man, still calm and composed, returned to his seat, his confidence unwavering. He had made his point, and the passengers had rallied behind him. Yet, unbeknownst to most of them, the man was not just any ordinary first-class passenger. As the flight moved toward cruising altitude, the flight attendant's discomfort only grew, realizing the gravity of her actions. She had never expected this interaction to escalate the way it had, nor could she have imagined that the man she had so carelessly insulted was someone of great importance. Her eyes wandered around the cabin, her mind racing with regret, when a sudden interruption caught everyone by surprise. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot, a middle-aged man with a crisp uniform and a calm demeanor, stepped into the cabin. He made his way toward the front of the plane, where the CEO sat. As he walked, he briefly glanced at the flight attendant, offering a slight nod. With a respectful air, the pilot approached the man in the first-class seat and addressed him with a tone of recognition. "Good evening, Chairman," the pilot said, his voice carrying clearly enough for a few curious passengers to overhear. The words hit like a thunderclap. "Chairman?" The passengers exchanged startled glances, unsure if they had heard right. A few whispered to one another, their curiosity piqued, while the flight attendant stood frozen in place, her heart sinking into her stomach. She had been too hasty, too judgmental, and had insulted someone who, it seemed, was at the very top of the airline hierarchy. The man smiled politely at the pilot, his response measured and graceful. "Thank you, Captain. We're on schedule, I trust." "Yes, Chairman. Everything is proceeding as expected," the pilot replied. He then turned his attention back to the flight attendant, whose face had drained of color. The shock was written all over her face as she realized the man she had berated was not just a random passenger, but the CEO of the entire airline. He was the one who signed off on the policies, the one who made the decisions that affected everyone aboard. The CEO's eyes briefly flicked to the flight attendant, whose awkward stance and pale complexion told the story of her panic. He didn't need to say anything out loud, but the flight attendant understood the unspoken message. The pilot, too, seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation and cleared his throat, preparing to act. The CEO, maintaining his composed demeanor, turned back to the pilot. I'll handle it from here. Thank you for your professionalism." With a slight nod, the pilot walked away, heading back to the cockpit. As the pilot exited, the CEO turned his attention to the flight attendant, his gaze firm but calm. His voice carried the authority that came with years of leadership, but it lacked any anger or venom. He spoke quietly, but every word was heavy with meaning. "Please come with me," the CEO instructed, his voice unwavering. The flight attendant, now realizing the true extent of her mistake, had no choice but to follow. She walked behind him in silence, every step feeling heavier than the last. The CEO led her toward the small crew area at the back of the cabin, away from the passengers. When they were out of earshot, the CEO turned to face her directly. "I'm disappointed," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers. "You represent this airline, and this is how you treat our passengers. With prejudice and disdain." The flight attendant stammered, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know. I thought—" "I'm sure you did," the CEO interrupted. His voice remained steady, but the weight of his words hung in the air. "You assumed, without any reason, that a passenger, based on his appearance, didn't belong in first class. That was your mistake. You've humiliated not only this man, but also this airline." He paused, his gaze unflinching, as he allowed the gravity of the situation to sink in. The flight attendant, her face flushed with embarrassment, opened her mouth to apologize, but the CEO held up a hand to stop her. "I expect you to reflect on your actions. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated. I'll be filing a report with HR, and you'll be receiving further communication. This is something we'll address seriously." The flight attendant, defeated, nodded in silence. Her stomach churned with regret as she realized the consequences of her actions were only just beginning. Meanwhile, the passengers who had witnessed the exchange were beginning to piece together what had transpired. The realization that the man in their midst wasn't just an ordinary passenger, but the head of the entire airline, spread quickly through the cabin. Whispers buzzed around the first-class section, with many passengers now looking at the CEO with renewed respect. As the flight continued, the CEO quietly returned to his seat, and the atmosphere in the cabin returned to normal. But it wasn't the same as before. A shift had occurred, a shift in the power dynamics within the flight, and a shift in the perceptions of the people aboard. It was clear that no one would be quick to judge again, especially when it came to the man who had once been unfairly scrutinized. The flight attendant, now completely aware of the mistake she had made, was left to face the consequences of her actions. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had quickly become a lesson in humility, accountability, and the weight of assumptions. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, the usual landing announcements began over the intercom, but this time there was a notable change. The voice that came through wasn't the typical flight crew member, but that of the CEO. The passengers in the first-class cabin immediately recognized it as his voice, and a quiet murmur rippled through the cabin as they realized what was happening. The CEO, calm and composed as always, began to speak to the entire plane, his words ringing clearly across the intercom. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began. "I'm the CEO of this airline, and I'd like to take a moment to speak with you about something that happened on this flight." A few passengers exchanged glances, sensing that this was going to be more than just an announcement about the weather or flight details. The CEO continued, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Recently, we witnessed an unfortunate incident where a passenger was subjected to unnecessary scrutiny based solely on his appearance. he said, deliberately leaving the details vague but making the issue clear. In this world, and in this airline, we believe that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, deserves the same level of respect and dignity. Every person has earned their place, whether it's in first class or any other part of life. The CEO's voice grew stronger as he spoke about the core values that he believed should guide the airline. At this airline, we stand for equality and inclusivity. We treat each other with kindness and fairness, not based on assumptions or biases. Our mission goes beyond providing great service on a plane. We aim to provide a great example of how we should all treat each other, no matter our differences. His words were powerful, and passengers listened intently, some nodding in agreement. The speech wasn't just about a simple apology for the incident. It was a reminder of the values the airline stood for, and the moral compass that should guide all interactions, not just on a flight, but in daily life. Today, I want to remind everyone on this plane, and anyone who hears about this, that respect and dignity are not optional. They are fundamental. No one, no matter who they are or where they come from, should ever feel that they don't belong or that they're being judged unfairly. We are all equals in this world, he finished, his voice strong and resolute. The silence that followed his announcement lasted only a moment before the cabin erupted into applause. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed the interaction earlier, stood and clapped in support. Some even cheered, clearly moved by the CEO's words and the courage he had shown in taking the opportunity to speak out. It wasn't just a round of polite clapping. The applause felt genuine, heartfelt, as if the passengers were grateful for this rare moment of public accountability. People were standing in their seats, clapping with enthusiasm, while some even exchanged smiles, making eye contact with one another to acknowledge the significance of the moment. For the CEO, it wasn't about seeking praise. His decision to speak was grounded in the principle that actions had consequences, but it was also about using his platform to make a statement that was far bigger than the confines of the flight. His message about respect, equality, and dignity echoed far beyond the airline's walls. Meanwhile, in the back of the cabin, the flight attendant who had instigated the incident sat quietly. She didn't speak or move, but the weight of the situation was clear. Her actions had become the catalyst for a much larger conversation about values, treatment, and justice. The spotlight had shifted. The applause was no longer for her, it was for the CEO, for the passengers who stood up for what was right, and for the quiet heroism of the man who had stood his ground despite the unfair treatment. As the flight continued its descent, the passengers reflected on the powerful lesson that had unfolded before them. It was a lesson about treating others with respect, not only because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the cornerstone of a society that valued equality and fairness for all. The CEO's words would stay with them long after the plane landed. Upon the plane's arrival, the atmosphere was thick with tension as the passengers disembarked. The airline acted swiftly, issuing a public statement shortly after the incident that condemned the flight attendant's behavior. The statement emphasized the airline's unwavering commitment to inclusivity, respect, and equality, affirming that no passenger would ever face the kind of discrimination that had occurred on that flight. The statement went on to clarify that the airline was taking immediate action regarding the attendant's conduct. An internal review was launched, and the attendant was reassigned to a non-public-facing role while the investigation was ongoing. The airline made it clear that they would not tolerate such behavior and would hold all employees accountable for upholding the values of fairness and respect. Meanwhile, the story quickly gained traction, spreading across social media and news outlets. People from all walks of life shared the tale of the black man in first class and the CEO's powerful response, praising him for his leadership and for using his position to address prejudice head-on. The public was overwhelmingly supportive, with many applauding the CEO's composure and commitment to making the airline a more welcoming place for everyone. In the wake of the incident, the story sparked a broader conversation about racial prejudice, privilege, and the importance of judging others based on their character rather than stereotypes. The CEO's decisive actions became an example of how leaders in any field should confront discrimination. The viral story served as a timely reminder that while prejudice may still exist in society, standing up against it and calling out those responsible is crucial in creating positive change. Over time, the impact of the incident continued to resonate, not just within the company, but across a wider audience. People began reflecting on their own biases, recognizing how small, seemingly insignificant moments of prejudice could perpetuate harmful stereotypes. The conversation around diversity and inclusion gained momentum, encouraging others to look beyond appearances and to value every individual based on their contributions and integrity. The lasting effect was clear. The incident sparked change, opened hearts, and fostered an environment where respect and equality were no longer just aspirational, but expected. The story showcases several important themes, each contributing to the broader message of standing against discrimination and fostering respect and equality. One of the most powerful aspects of this narrative is the idea of dignity in the face of discrimination. The CEO's calm and composed response to the flight attendant's behavior demonstrates the strength that comes from maintaining dignity. Despite the flight attendant's hostile actions, the CEO does not react with anger or aggression. Instead, he uses his position and authority to address the situation with grace, reinforcing the idea that rising above discrimination is not about tolerating harmful actions, but responding in a way that preserves one's integrity. His dignified response shows that maintaining composure can be an incredibly powerful tool in challenging stereotypes and prejudices. Another central theme in this story is accountability. The swift and firm action taken against the flight attendant after the incident sends a clear message that discriminatory behavior will not be tolerated, regardless of the context. The airline's immediate condemnation of the behavior and the assurance that an internal review would be conducted highlights the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions. This theme is crucial in addressing systemic prejudice, as it shows that people must be responsible for their behavior, especially when it involves demeaning others based on race, appearance, or status. The reassignment of the flight attendant and the ongoing investigation into her conduct demonstrate that the company values inclusivity and equality, taking concrete steps to rectify any form of bias. This serves as a reminder that true change begins with accountability, and every individual should be held responsible for their conduct, especially when it harms others. The theme of unity is also explored through the response of the passengers. When the CEO addresses the cabin over the intercom, he is met with an outpouring of applause and support from the other passengers. This collective action highlights the power of solidarity in standing against injustice. The passengers' unified response not only supports the CEO, but strengthens the message that prejudice should never be tolerated. It serves as a reminder that when people come together and lend their voices to a cause, their actions are amplified. The willingness of the passengers to speak up in even small ways helps foster an environment where everyone feels empowered to stand against injustice. Their applause is a powerful reminder that it is not enough to be non-racist. One must actively oppose racism and discrimination when it occurs. The solidarity shown by the passengers emphasizes the importance of collective action in making a difference and creating lasting change. These themes, dignity, accountability, and unity, combine to create a narrative that not only highlights the importance of confronting prejudice, but also illustrates the strength found in collective action. The events on the plane reveal how leadership, integrity, and solidarity can inspire change and make an impact, not only in the lives of individuals, but also in the larger societal framework.